We are embarking on the Civil War history of Knoxville, Tennessee. There were 3 battles and 1 raid that took place. These will be broken up into battles for Lenoir Station, Campbell Station, and Fort Sanders, and Sanders Raid. Come along with us as we begin the fight for the heart of East Tennessee. All aboard the Kentucky-Tennessee Living Time Machine. Please fasten your seatbelts and keep your arms and legs inside of the vehicle at all times. But to get going, we need your help. We still need to fire up that time machine to help transport us. Please help us by clicking on the like, subscribe, and bell notification buttons down below. Not only does this help fire up the time machine, but it convinces the YouTube algorithm that we need a bigger time machine to reach more people who love history as much as you do. Now, back to our story. Lincoln's plea. President Abraham Lincoln and other government authorities from the very early days of the Civil War constantly urged the Union generals in charge of the war to invade and protect East Tennessee. There were 2 major reasons why Washington, D.C. felt that this was a very important area to protect. The first reason was that there were 2 major railways that passed through the area. The East Tennessee and Georgia Railroad connected Knoxville and Chattanooga, Tennessee to Dalton, Georgia. The East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad connected Knoxville with Bristol, Virginia. The second reason was that the area was mainly full of residents that were Unionist supporters. Under the regime of the Confederacy, they were having to endure raids of their homes, arrests of the men, and other indignities. Even though the rest of the state of Tennessee was supporting the Confederacy, East Tennessee remained loyal to the end to Washington, D.C. The logistics problem. The Cumberland Plateau is not a very easy area to gain access to. Surrounded by the Appalachian Mountains, there were no other railroads connecting this area to the outside world. The wagon roads were difficult, if not impassable, in the inclement weather. This would pose a potential issue for the invading Union forces, as supply lines could easily be attacked or delayed. There were plans that were encouraged by Lincoln to build a railroad. However, these plans were scrapped as it was deemed to take too much time to build this railroad in such treacherous conditions. The Union 23rd Corps and the Army of the Ohio. Major General George Lucas Hartsuff was placed in command of the newly formed 23rd Corps on April 27, 1863. This unit would join with the 9th Corps from the Eastern Theater to form the Army of the Ohio and under the command of Major General Ambrose Burnside. The plan was to hit East Tennessee on 2 fronts at the same time. Burnside was tasked to invade East Tennessee on the same day that the Army of the Cumberland was ordered to capture Chattanooga, Tennessee. As I have said, that was the plan. But as with anything concerning Burnside, that was not how it went. Vicksburg delayed the plans. On June 2, 1863, Burnside and his Army of the Ohio left Burnside's headquarters in Cincinnati, Ohio. The very next day, instead of following Lincoln's orders and marching into East Tennessee, Burnside received orders and sent 8,000 of his men from the 9th Corps under the command of Major General John Parke to assist General Grant with the siege of Vicksburg. This caused a delay in the invasion of East Tennessee until August 16th. However, earlier in May of 1863, 9th Corps Brigadier General Orlando B. Wilcox recommended that Colonel William P. Sanders take command of an operation to invade East Tennessee, with the mission to destroy important railroad bridges around the Knoxville, Tennessee area to make the supply trains for the Confederate Army stop running. Colonel Sanders was appointed commander of the 5th Kentucky Cavalry Regiment on March 4, 1863. Under this recommendation, Burnside ordered a cavalry raid which destroyed railroad bridges east and west of Knoxville, Tennessee. Sanders' forces. On June 14, 1863, Sanders left Mount Vernon, Kentucky with 1,500 Union mounted soldiers and 2 artillery guns from the following regiments: The 1st Tennessee Infantry Regiment under the command of Colonel Robert K. Byrd. 44th Ohio Infantry Regiment under the command of Major Alpheus S. Moore. The 112th Illinois Infantry Regiment under the command of Major Tristan T. Dow. 2nd Ohio Cavalry Regiment under the command of Captain David E. Welsh. 7th Ohio Cavalry Regiment under the command of Captain Richard C. Rankin. 1st Kentucky Cavalry Regiment under the command of Captain George Dry. Battery D, 1st Ohio Light Artillery Conkles under the command of Lieutenant Henry C. Lloyd. Sanders took a supply wagon train containing forage and other provisions with him from Mount Vernon to Williamsburg, Kentucky. They covered a distance of 60 miles, following the Cumberland River. When the troops were in Williamsburg, Sanders ordered a supply wagon train to return with a guard of 200 horsemen. Sanders and Buckner. Sanders knew that Brigadier General Simon Bolivar Buckner, who was department commander of the forces guarding the border of Tennessee, would hear of the Union movements. Using this information, Sanders created a diversion. Using another unit of federal forces, rode south of Williamsburg, Kentucky, towards Big Creek Gap, Tennessee. This worked, and Buckner was fooled by the ruse, in that he moved the majority of his troops to Clinton, Tennessee, just 15 miles to the northwest outside of Knoxville. Sanders and his men passed west of Buckner at Huntsville, Tennessee. Colonel Sanders' first raid, Wartburg. In the evening hours of June 17, 1863, Sanders and his men arrived near Montgomery, Tennessee. Shortly after arriving in Montgomery, Sanders received news that there was a Confederate cavalry unit that was camped nearby at Wartburg. Sanders ordered 400 men from the 1st Tennessee under the command of Colonel Robert K. Byrd to attack the Confederate troops. The men did a surprise attack which was in their favor. There were 2 officers, one of which was an aide to General Pegram, and 102 enlisted men that were captured in that raid, which were paroled. Their horses were seized. The men also captured 60 boxes of artillery ammunition and tools, 500 spades, and 100 picks, which they destroyed, several thousand pounds of bacon, salt, flour, and meal, and some corn, and other public stores, and 6 wagons with mule teams. There were a few of the command of this troop who were some distance away from the main camp. However, they were able to escape notice with their horses. These soldiers would go on to sound the first alarm that Sanders and his men were in the area. As the men grew closer to Kingston, Tennessee, it was discovered that Colonel John S. Scott's Confederate Cavalry Brigade was nearby. Scott's forces were guarding the ford at Clinch River and had 1 battery with them. Not wanting to engage a potentially overwhelming force, Sanders had his men to cross Clinch River 8 miles away from Scott at Waller's Ford. Sanders' second raid, Lenoir Station. The plan to destroy the East Tennessee and Georgia Railroad Bridge located in Loudon, Tennessee had to be scrapped. It was too heavily guarded by the 16th Alabama Infantry. This infantry had the force of 3 regiments and 8 pieces of artillery. They had been entrenched in the area for 2 weeks and had been able to dig rifle pits, ditches, and strengthen the works there. The commanding officer's courier had been captured by Sanders' men, and it was discovered that there were orders that the forces at Kingston was to follow the rear of Sanders' troops, and that the troops of Lenoir Station had been ordered to join forces at Loudon. After learning about this information, the raid on Loudon was scrapped. The bridge would remain guarded until the invasion of General Ambrose Burnside in September of 1863. So, a secondary target was planned for this raid. On June 19, 1863, at 8 a.m., Sanders' men descended upon Lenoir Station 30 minutes after the troops had left for Loudon. Sanders' men were able to capture a detachment of artillerymen with 3 iron 6-pounder field guns, 8 officers, 57 enlisted men. Sanders' men then left a path of destruction through the town that included destroying the depot, the general store, and the railroad car containing Confederate military supplies. Inside of the large brick depot, there were found 5 pieces of artillery with harnesses and saddles, ammunition, and military equipment. Also found within the depot was 2,500 stand of small arms, a very large amount of artillery and musket ammunition, and artillery and cavalry equipments. Inside of the railroad car was found saddles and artillery harness. They were able to cut the telegraph line, seize 75 horses and mules belonging to the Confederate States. Sanders had ordered his men to spare the brick cotton mill on the alleged grounds that he wished to protect the only source of cloth making for the local residents, who were Union sympathizers. However, it was later learned that the cotton mill was destroyed in a fire. It is not clear if this was accidental or by mistake. On their way out of town, the Union forces would stop every mile and cut the telegraph line, and would tear up the railroad track on their continued journey towards Knoxville, Tennessee. The Third Raid, Knoxville. Buckner had left 1,000 Confederate troops behind to defend the city of Knoxville, Tennessee. They were commanded by Colonel Robert C. Trigg, who was over the 6th Florida, 7th Florida, and the 57th Virginia Infantry Regiments. These troops were joined by the 200 private citizens and other soldiers who were not fit for active duty. There were 6 6-pounder field guns that were placed on McGee's Hill, Summit Hill, and Temperance Hill, outside of the city limits by Trigg. These guns were supported by infantry units. On June 19, 1863, Colonel William Sanders and his men had just finished the raid on Lenoir Station. By 7 p.m., they had moved just 8 miles west of Knoxville when their first skirmish happened. There were some Confederate pickets set up. Sanders' men were able to drive the pickets to within a mile of the city. Sanders then split up his men, leaving a portion of the 1st Kentucky Cavalry behind to watch the west side of the city. The other men were moved as soon as it was dark by using another road to swing around to the north side. The pickets were driven from several defense positions. The railroad was torn apart so that no reinforcements could be sent to the bridges that sat above the city. According to several sources, Dr. James Harvey Baker was intent on helping to join this defense, so he was armed with a rifle and a pistol. The Union soldiers believed that Dr. Baker was a Confederate soldier and then chased him into his house, where he was fatally wounded. However, Dr. Baker was able to wound one of the Union cavalrymen in return. From my reading of the way the accounts are written, it is unclear if Dr. Baker was actually taking a side in the war, or if he was defending the city that he loved. But regardless, he was seen as a Confederate soldier, and so was shot because of it. Early the next morning on June 20th, Sanders and his men moved up to the city using the Tazewell Road. The Confederates were well posted in their positions, using the heights and the adjacent buildings to set up their defenses. From his position, Sanders faced 8 or 9 pieces of artillery. The streets had been barricaded using cotton bales. The artillery was also protected using cotton bales as well. Sanders estimates by this time that 3,000 soldiers and citizens who had been pressed into service was facing down the Union raiders. Sanders attacked, and the skirmish lasted about an hour. After 1 soldier was killed and 2 were wounded, and on the other side had 4 men killed and 4 wounded, Sanders withdrew from the fight. However, his men were able to capture 2 of the 6-pounder guns, 31 men and 80 horses, tents, and all of the equipment of a regiment of conscripts. The Fourth Raid, Flat Creek and Strawberry Plains. After the withdrawal from Knoxville, Sanders began his trek eastward. Following the railroad, the raiders destroyed all of the small bridges and railroad depots they encountered. 4 miles southwest of Strawberry Plains, they came to Flat Creek. The defenders of the bridges had vacated the area. There, the raiders burned the covered bridge and county bridge. It was at this point that Sanders and his men traveled 3 miles down the railroad and crossed the Holston River to destroy the bridge on the same side as the Confederates were camped. As Sanders was approaching Strawberry Plains, the raiders were spotted, and the Confederate forces opened fire with their 4 pieces of artillery. Sanders had his infantry to dismount. He ordered Major Moore and the 44th Ohio up the river for his attack. Sanders then ordered Colonel Byrd and Major Dow to get in the Confederate rear to attempt to cut off the bridge guard's retreat. The two forces collided and skirmished for an hour. The Confederates had a locomotive that had a full head of steam and was waiting, and the retreating army boarded and left the area. They left in such a hurry that they left behind 2 officers and 137 enlisted men who surrendered to the raiders. Also captured were a vast amount of stores, ammunition, and provisions. These included 600 sacks of salt, 70 tents, and a vast quantity of camp equipment. Sanders and his men remained overnight at Strawberry Plains, and while they were there, they destroyed a 2,100-foot bridge and a 1,600-foot long bridge that was supported by 11 piers. The trestle work to this bridge was also destroyed. The 5th Raid, Mossy Creek. During the dawn hours of June 21st, Sanders and his men moved east to Mossy Creek near Jefferson City, Tennessee. The raiders were able to capture 120 men who were guarding the bridge there. They then destroyed the Mossy Creek Bridge, which was 300 feet long, and destroyed several railroad cars and their contents. Inside of the cars included several hundred barrels of saltpeter, 200 barrels of sugar, and other supplies. They also destroyed the road at all convenient points and destroyed the nearby saltpeter factory and the machinery of a nearby gun factory. Understanding that his troops were now a target for the Confederate forces in the area, Sanders made a break for Rogers Gap on the Cumberland Mountain. Passing through the gaps of the Cumberland Mountains, Sanders was able to cross the Holston Valley at a ford located at Hayworth's Bend. The troops then headed for Powder Springs Gap in Clinch Mountain. Unexpectedly, the Union raiders found themselves in a trap. There was a Confederate force in front of them and a Confederate force that was coming up from the rear. There was a skirmish on the rear guard. However, Sanders used the country roads to evade these forces and was able to pass through the gap without resistance or loss to his forces. When approaching Rogers Gap, the troops were within a mile and a half of the gap when it was discovered that the trees had been felled and were obstructing the road. This was guarded by artillery and infantry. All gaps at this point were now guarded in this manner. Sanders destroyed his artillery equipment to make the escape easier. Destroyed was the artillery guns, 2 pieces of artillery that they had taken with them, and 3 pieces of captured artillery, cartridges, harness, and ammunition before leaving them, and moved by the wooded path to the Smith's Gap, which was 3 miles away. There was now a large force of Confederates to the front and rear of Sanders, and by using the wooded paths he was able to avoid capture. Sanders was met at Smith's Gap by a regiment of Confederate cavalry. Sanders' men were able to drive them from the gap. The road over this gap was very rough, and the Union forces were split apart because the gap was reached after nightfall, and some of the troops took the wrong road. However, these troops were able to once again join with Sanders once they crossed into Kentucky. Return of Sanders to Kentucky. Many horses had to be left behind because they gave out. Even though several hundred horses were captured in the raids, there was not enough horses to go around to all of the mounted men. Sanders and his men were able to reach Boston, Kentucky on June 24, 1863. The total losses for the raids was 2 men killed, 4 men wounded, and 13 men missing. There were a total of 461 men who were captured and pardoned by Sanders and his men. Sanders was able to give Burnside valuable information about the area and how many potential troops that there would have to be dealt with. The Confederate forces was larger than expected, and the reasons for the Loudon Bridge not being taken and destroyed was given to Burnside. Also of note, Sanders and his men were able to capture a total of 10 pieces of artillery, but the other 7 were reported as being destroyed rather than taken with them. In July 1863, Sanders and his men would pursue Morgan's raiders. He was appointed to the rank of Chief of the Cavalry Corps of the Department of the Ohio in September 1863. Sanders' death. Sanders would move his troops to Knoxville, Tennessee, and arrived on September 3, 1863. There, he was appointed to the rank of Brigadier General on October 18, 1863. This rank was not official, as it had not been confirmed by the Senate of the United States. From November 3, 1863 to November 18, 1863, he commanded the brigade of the 23rd Corps and then the 1st Division of the Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Ohio in the Knoxville campaign. On November 18, 1863, Sanders was fighting on the Kingston Road, 1 mile from the Confederate defenses at Knoxville, when a shot rang out from a sharpshooter, who it is believed has set up his nest in the tower of the Bleak House. This sharpshooter was from the forces under the command of Colonel Edward Porter Alexander, who was a classmate and roommate of Sanders at West Point. The shot landed in the side of Sanders, mortally wounding him. Sanders was transported to Lenoir House and stayed in the bridal suite until his death the next day. At first, his body was laid to rest under the cover of darkness at the cemetery of the Second Presbyterian Church. Sanders' coffin was later moved to the Chattanooga National Cemetery in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Even though he was a bachelor at the time of his death, he was dating a Knoxville native, Sue Boyd. Boyd was a relative of Belle Boyd, a Confederate spy. Even though Boyd was a relative to the Confederate spy, it is widely believed that she never betrayed his confidence in her. She has been reported to have mourned his death. The Union fortification named Fort Loudon was renamed in his memory to Fort Sanders. 10 days after his death, the Battle of Fort Sanders took place, which was part of the Knoxville campaign. Thank you. We at Kentucky Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the Appalachian Civil War battles. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell notification button. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries in Appalachian history.